Welcome to MindTricks Radio, where we'll explore contemporary topics in psychology through interviewing creative and innovative thinkers in the field. I'm your host, Dr. Aaron Kaplan. Thanks for tuning in. We're here today with Dr. Christopher Dwyer, a senior researcher at the Technological University of the Shannon in the Republic of Ireland, specializing in cognition and education with international expertise in the field of critical thinking. Chris has authored over 40 peer-reviewed research papers, as well as 2 books, both published by Cambridge University Press, 2017's Critical Thinking, Historical Perspectives and Practical Guidelines, and the recently released Knowledge Doesn't Exist and Other Thoughts on Critical Thinking. Chris served as the special guest editor for the Journal of Intelligence's special issue on critical thinking in everyday life. Chris also wrote the Teaching Critical Thinking Encyclopedia entry for the Sage Encyclopedia of Higher Education, and since 2017, writes an ongoing blog, Thoughts on Thinking for Psychology Today. Hey, Chris, welcome back. It's great to see you.
Thanks very much, Aaron. Thank you for having me.
I had you on, it was probably around 2022, sort of at the tail end of the pandemic, and we had a really fun conversation about critical thinking and cognitive biases, and I think you taught me all about the Dunning-Kruger effect and sunk cost fallacy and a bunch of that kind of stuff. And that was a very popular episode, so I was really excited to have you come on and talk more about critical thinking and some of the things around that.
Yeah, it was a great chat. And happy to be back, and I'll always talk about critical thinking, so I'm delighted the opportunity.
You've been a busy man. You have written a new book since then. It's called Knowledge Doesn't Exist and Other Thoughts on Critical Thinking. I'd be really interested to hear a little bit about that before we dig into our conversation today. And I also wanted to thank you. I know it's late in Ireland. We almost have opposite spectrums of the time zones here. It's early in the morning in Hawaii, it's in the evening, and you have a family. So thank you so much for making time for me here. Tell me about this book, Chris, this new book that you've published.
Yeah, so Knowledge Doesn't Exist. It's one of those kind of weird titles that's slightly provocative, and I guess purposefully so. You know, if you look at the book, I think the book cover is kind of telling in that way too, because it's just a fish on there. And there's a certain ambiguity of like, why a fish, you know? Especially a critical thinking book, you'd imagine there'd be a light bulb or Rodin's thinker or something like that. I guess it requires you to know a little something about fish. And that fish is a salmon. And it also requires you to know a little bit about Irish mythology. And we have a story about the salmon of knowledge. And then another thing about the cover is that it's only a fish on a blue background. Now, you might interpret that background as the water, or you might interpret it as a table with a blue tablecloth. Those have significant implications for that salmon, because if it's in the water, you could assume that it's alive and well. If it's on a table, it probably isn't. So in a way, it's almost like Schrodinger's salmon. Is it alive? Is it dead? When I'm playing with the idea of the imagery and all that, it brought back the sketch from Monty Python's Flying Circus, where John Cleese is talking about this parrot, you know, and it's dead, and he whacks it off the table, and he says, this parrot has ceased to be, you know? And, you know, if it ceases to be, if it's dead, then it doesn't exist. And it's, you know, kind of this metaphor, I guess, this symbolism that this fish, the salmon of knowledge, is it dead or is it alive? Does it exist or does it not? And that's kind of what I'm getting at. And I guess there's a little kind of, you know, it's a very niche joke or whatever you want to call it, a very, very inside joke, I guess, in the sense that everything I kind of said to you up until this point requires you to know a lot of things about a lot of things. And if you don't know those things, you're not going to get the joke. And that's the point. A lot of times we don't know what we don't know. And if we kind of treat life like that and treat information and knowledge like that, we'll start to really, you know, kind of consider, does knowledge actually exist? Am I knowledgeable? Do I have knowledge? How can I know? What do I know? I know nothing, in a very kind of Socratic kind of way. That's the kind of starting point in terms of what the book is. It requires you to think about knowledge. I guess I was trying to write a book about epistemology. and epistemological understanding. But I think if you say those words or those phrases to a person, on the street, who doesn't research this stuff on a daily basis, they'll look at you like you have three heads on. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to take this idea of epistemology and make it sexy for the larger population and help people kind of get to know what knowledge is all about, what it really means to know something, and how we can use that in our thinking. So, where my first book was very much on what critical thinking is, what it consists of, how we should do it, this book kind of goes into a more real world scenario, everyday settings in which we kind of account for the idea that we don't know everything. Maybe we've got some training in critical thinking. Maybe we've never heard of critical thinking before. But what can I do with the knowledge that I have and apply that in a way where I'll see benefits in my decision making? What can I look out for? What should I think about in terms of applying my knowledge, even though I have no real background in critical thinking at all?
Very cool. And real briefly, Chris, give us a definition of epistemology. Like, how do you define that exactly?
Ooh, yeah, that's a tough one. Because I think a lot of people will give you very, very different ways of looking at it. I typically look at it as, any word you have with OG at the end, it's the study of. So we'll always say it's the study of knowledge. But I think it's a better way of putting it is the understanding of the nature and limits of knowledge. So the idea is that I know that my name is Chris Dwyer, and it probably always will be Chris Dwyer, but I can't see into the future. I can't be sure that that will always be the case. Why do I say that? When could that ever change? If I found out 15 years down the line that I was adopted, or we have hit a new social construct where marriages now, instead of the woman changing her last name, it'll be the husband changing the last name. You don't know when I might cease to be Chris Dwyer, or even the day of my death. Have I stopped being Chris Dwyer? Well, there is no longer that person who is, there was a Chris Dwyer, so by definition, there is no longer. So it all depends on how you conceptualize it. And people conceptualize things very differently. And based on how they conceptualize it, it's a different piece of knowledge.
Yeah, really fascinating. And I have to admit, like after hearing your discussion about even the thought behind the image on the cover of your book, I'm really impressed with that. I have to admit, I was really just thinking Monty Python when I saw the fish, and it kind of ended there. So now I see how deep the thought is in terms of how you could interpret that and the perception of it. So that's really cool.
It's as well, like it's provocative, and I want it to be provocative because I want people to think, what's this guy talking about? I want some people to go, this guy's an idiot. What is he talking about? Like, and it's almost like rage bait, where they need to buy this book, read it, and see how much of an idiot I am. And then, kind of go, oh, he made some good points. I'm glad I picked up this book. I was annoyed when I saw it first. Or alternatively, people will know what I'm getting at, and just kind of look at epistemology from a critical thinking standpoint.
Yeah, well, I'm going to give you some rage bait moments in this interview because rather than just sort of like having a dry approach here, I'm going to throw some pretty provocative questions at you that I think are stem directly from the book, actually. I'm curious to hear how you sort of squirm out of it and give me some good explanations, which I'm sure you will. So I'm really excited to get into that. To begin with, though, like just as a really brief primer, tell us a little bit about critical thinking. Like, what do you mean, first off, just as a baseline, what is critical thinking?
Yeah, great question. One of the most commonly misinterpreted takes on critical thinking in higher order cognition is critical thinking. First and foremost, I'm going to say, and it's only something that I've kind of noticed recently, this misinterpretation. It is good thinking. People will say, "Oh, well, it's good thinking with beneficial outcomes in the decision making." Yes, that's all true. But why critical? Why not just good thinking? It's not critical in terms of critique. A lot of people get that wrong. I've noticed recently. They're like, well, it's about critiquing. It's not. It's critical because it's important. And there's a big difference there. I will always tell people that they should only apply critical thinking in situations where the decision is important to them because it is effortful. It does take time. And if you don't want to put in the effort and you don't have the time to do it, you're probably not going to yield a decision that is on the same level as one that would be achieved through critical thinking. Now, what do I actually mean by it? I can give you a long definition. I won't bother. What I'll tell you is that there's three core parts of critical thinking. There's a series of skills that need to be used. One needs to have the right disposition towards critical thinking. So you need to be inclined to do certain things, inclined to think in certain ways, and you need to be motivated to do it. And then the third part of it is something called reflective judgment. And that's where your epistemology comes in. You need to be willing to not jump to a conclusion and take a step back and say, whoa, this is a heavy topic here. Let me think about this for a minute. What do I know? What do I feel? And can I differentiate the knowing from the feeling and the believing? And what are the differences? What do I want to be the right answer versus what really is the right answer? So being able to kind of account for all of those variables that might be impacting you while you're trying to make a decision, that's that reflective judgment. But when it comes down to the skills, the things that they will teach you in a critical thinking course, you're going to learn how to analyze, you're going to learn how to evaluate, and you're going to learn to infer information from a variety of arguments and sources and what have you. All the skills, they can be taught. It's that reflective judgment and that disposition towards critical thinking that needs to develop over time.
I actually remember in our previous interview I did with you, we dug into that pretty deeply, looking at those
Yeah.
three aspects of critical thinking. So I'd really encourage listeners, if you want to hear a deeper dive onto that, go back and listen to the previous episode with Chris. It's fantastic. But that's, I think, a great explanation. And I'm glad it's not too simple because obviously this is a complicated subject and we want to make sure we're being precise with these. Now, getting into your book, let's just start with this provocative chapter you have titled Knowledge Doesn't Exist. Walk me through this, Chris. What do you mean by knowledge doesn't exist?
We know that there's something called information. And information is something that we typically take on. From a cognitive psychology standpoint, we attend to it, we try to comprehend it, we encode it in memory, we'll play with it in working memory for as long as we need it. And if it turns out we don't need it terribly long, we're not going to worry about it at all and we'll likely forget it. If it turns out that it's of benefit or we need to remember it, we'll encode in a deeper level, maybe to long-term memory. And we'll store it there in long-term memory. And that'll be just information we have. But as we have that stored there, that's what we treat as knowledge. But there's a lot of assumptions going on in terms of whether that knowledge is correct or not. How that information got there, there's no prereq for whether it came from a credible source, how we initially felt about it. Now, how we initially felt about it will impact it, how it is encoded. But over time, we have a tendency to forget, even if we know something. There's a very interesting little handbook on debunking by Cook and Lewandowski, and they talk about this concept that if we learn information and we're told as we're learning the information that it's incorrect, over time, we'll actually forget that caveat that it's incorrect and we'll
Oh,
still hold on to that information. And we might later use that information as if it were fact down the road.
yeah, interesting.
So, so the point is, I guess, that I'm trying to make is that we have a way of looking at knowledge as it must be true. Why would we store it if it wasn't true? And the unfortunate thing is that's not always the case. You might explain something very, very complex to me, and I'll nod along and go, uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. And I'll form a schema for that information. I'll organize something into my cognitive architecture about what you've explained to me. And if you would ask me 2 weeks from now, did I understand it? I'd say, yeah, absolutely. I probably need a little bit more information. I would probably need to do another lesson on it, and I can be cautious about it. But the fact is that I'm making a lot of assumptions about how well I understood you. And if I get one or two things wrong in that understanding, that kind of has a big impact on that quote unquote knowledge. It's incomplete knowledge. it's, misinformed knowledge, but it all comes down to how we understand something.
Yeah. Well, Chris, you can understand the rabbit hole that one could easily go down with this way of thinking about knowledge, right? Like, basically, you could say nothing is actually true, and all knowledge that anybody possesses is just their take on information that they've obtained from whatever sources. And so, if all knowledge is just interpreted information from every which way, then how do people survive without feeling certain about things? Like you think people would drop into cynicism, paralysis about making decisions and understanding things, even becoming nihilistic because nothing is actually true. Come on, Chris, how do we handle this?
Yeah, well, yeah, I see your point, and I think there's a lot of people have kind of gone down this rabbit hole, and I
Mm,
think a lot of people have done it in a kind of in almost a self-affirming way. From a mental health perspective, isn't actually a bad thing, although in a cognitive perspective, completely wrong. What I mean by that is, there's a couple parts in the book where I refer to Oprah. Oprah, would tell you to live your truth kind of thing. And what that implies is, everyone has their own reality. And of course, everyone has their own reality, but that doesn't change that we live in a shared reality. And you have your different perspectives on things, and you're entitled to those perspectives, and as I do mine and the like. But that doesn't change what knowledge is from person to person. It just acknowledges that we have a different perspective on it. So, is there actually knowledge? Well, yeah, there is, but it's taking what we know and we flip it on its side. When we look at science, and good science at that, we typically think about scientists in a lab or looking at the stars trying to find something. That is true, and that helps form hypotheses for experiments and the like, but that's not exactly true. I often refer to the dirtiest word in critical thinking. The dirtiest word in critical thinking is proof.
mm.
And I try to tell my students that as well. Inevitably is the case that you'll get to the conclusion section of an essay or an assignment, and through this essay, I have proved that. I say, you haven't proved anything. I said, I know for a fact you haven't proved anything because researchers have been, dedicated their lives to doing this very topic above and beyond you and your 2.5 hours, sitting down writing this, and they haven't proved it. Why? Because we can't prove anything. We can only disprove. From a philosophy of science perspective, when we think about things like falsification, this is where it's all stemming from. So psychologists listening to this will know that, when we run our t-tests and our ANOVAs, it's not that we're proving the experimental hypothesis when we notice an effect. What we're actually doing is we're disproving the null hypothesis, which means that when we observe something happening, it's not that we're observing something happening. We're actually saying it is not the case that nothing happened.
Yeah.
And why do we say that? Well, we think what we've done, how we think we've intervened, is what's doing, doing the good job. If you've got a new therapy for the sake of argument, you're running the therapy and you've noticed from time one to time two that there's been a noticeable improvement, and compared to controls, this is a significant effect. But that could be down to anything else in the world above and beyond the therapy itself.
Yeah, it's very difficult to parse that out and control for things. That's right.
Exactly, and we do our best, and that's why we use rigorous methods in clinical trials and the like. But it comes down to it at the end of the day that our even our statistics are based on the idea that we're not proving that something happened. We're simply saying it is not the case that nothing happened. So in that case, we're not proving. We cannot prove. We can only disprove. That's where we take that idea of, is there anything that's fact? Yes, there are plenty of facts out there. X doesn't work. Y doesn't work. Z doesn't work. Now, can you tell me what does work? No, no, we can't. But then again, we have to say that's not a bad thing. We're just very cautious. And you mentioned, a lot of people could, fall down a route of nihilism, and what does it matter if nothing is actually real?
Yeah.
In a way, this should be kind of liberating in the sense that science is amazing and it's wonderful, and it's opened up all these possibilities, and we can look down this avenue for, research in this avenue. And I think if you want to treat it in a negative light, you can. And I'll give you a really good example, and it's in the book as well, right? Is that in 2006, Pluto was declassified as a planet.
Right. It was no longer a planet.
That's right. So we have 8 planets, even though, you and I and many of your listeners will have grown up with 9 planets, and now we have 8.
Right.
And I always say that there's two extremes of people in terms of, the audience when they first hear this. One extreme will be someone like me, be like, "Oh, this is amazing. This is so cool." Imagine that we are now at a point where, like, millions and millions and millions of miles away, we're able to look at this celestial body and determine based on certain characteristics whether or not it's a planet or a dwarf planet. And we even have a classification system for this. That's amazing. Way to go, science. And then on the other hand, you have you have people going, what the hell is wrong with these scientists? They can't even count planets. It's
Yeah.
it's not that hard, 8, 9, which is it? And then they get aggravated and they say, you can't change something like this. There's 9 planets. We can count them. Are we paying? How much are we paying? How much of our tax money is going towards counting planets? And people get really, riled up about it. I will take the perspective of the first perspective, hands down, all the time. They know that things change. It's not that there are no facts, it's that knowledge is constantly changing. So, gravity, for the sake of argument. So, you take a sip from your glass. If you were to let go of that glass, what would happen?
It would fall and smash on the ground, and I have to clean up my coffee.
I would bet my mortgage on it, right? And the reason why that's the case is because of gravity.
Hmm.
That glass is going to fall to the ground at an acceleration of 9.81 meters per second squared. Okay, that's how good at measuring this stuff. This is not really up for debate. But gravity remains a theory because you cannot prove the nature of gravity. It
Hmm.
is what we observe at the moment and will continue to be the working model for how things are in terms of gravity until something changes it,
Yeah.
until we advance knowledge so much that we learn something new about the nature of it. That's not a bad thing. That shouldn't be scary. That should be exciting.
Well, Chris, going back to Pluto for a minute, one thing I was thinking is you're right. People could have different reactions to Pluto being classified as a dwarf planet or a planetoid or whatever, and people could get up in arms about it. But one thing is, as far as we know, nothing's actually changed about Pluto. It's the same rock with the same composition in the same spot in the solar
Absolutely.
system. It's just we've chosen to define it differently.
Exactly. Exactly. And like a lot of this, a lot of it comes down to semantics. I made the point earlier, right? I said in the case of science and proving and disproving, I said it is not the case that nothing happened. That's a mouthful, and it takes people, a hot second to kind of work their heads around it.
Yeah.
And then someone who's very, very practical will say, "So something happened." And I go, "No." Well, and I go into that whole kind of spiel about it.
Yeah.
Something did happen, but we can't be sure what happened. And they go, I don't like your indecision. And that's the kind of thing about critical thinking. It's that we sometimes sacrifice the practical nature of things for precision.
Yeah. So let's get into something that's related and is a little fuzzier, perhaps, but I think it is very relevant. And let's talk about the unreliability of memory and experience. And I know you discussed this. People obviously use their memory of things. You've talked about that, the knowledge that people obtain from stuff and what they think about it, and obviously their experiences navigating the world. And obviously, I think from what we've talked about, experiences can be flawed, and so can memories of things can be distorted. So, how do people anchor truth in their own experience and memories if we know that it's a very good chance that they're flawed or they have a altered perception of what actually happened or what somebody else might be experiencing?
I think that's one of those million-dollar questions. I don't think there is a way of overcoming it per se, but I think it's one of those things that if we make people aware of it, more aware of it, and are willing to admit our own shortcomings in our own memory from time to time. And as an example, and say, listen, we don't always remember it, right? There's a very good chance you don't either. And I think a lot of that comes down to intellectual integrity. I don't think enough people are willing to say, I don't know. I don't think enough people are willing to say, I'm happy to look that up. When I was younger and we were kind of all doing our postgrads, and from time to time we'd be asked to go teach a class. And the biggest fear among us as young 20 somethings were, imagine now if we got asked a question in class and we didn't know the answer. And we came
Yeah.
up with all these possible ways of kind of dancing around it. And one of the more comical solutions was, if you were asked a question that you didn't know, you'd say, that's a really good question. For homework this week, go home and get the answer to that. And we all laughed, but I realized, looking back at it years later, I said that's one of the worst responses you could give, because it's actually putting your students off asking questions, because they say, "Oh no, if I ask a question now in class, he's going to make us do that for homework." And the one thing I do want students now is ask me all of the questions, and I will be honest with you. And that's the thing. I think there's that intellectual integrity that one develops over time, particularly in our field, is that you're willing to admit when you don't know.
Yeah.
And you say, that's kind of out of my remit of knowledge, but it's a very interesting question. And you know what? You go look it up. I'll look it up too. And let's talk, let's discuss it next week.
Yeah.
Great question. I'll remember that, come exam time, because really insightful question. And I think we need to show that we appreciate and we respect tough questions. But that's not always the case. We don't always deal with intellectual integrity, and that's not to say that people are always dealing with it. If you ask me, and if I'm tired and I'm not really kind of in the right mindset, and you ask me a question, I might give you an answer that I think is right, or I feel is it's probably the right answer, and that's a good enough kind of answer. And it also comes down to how much I care about that topic. What do I think about that topic area? Do I value it? And if I don't value it, I probably won't give you a very good answer. But if I do, I'm going to be very precise and as comprehensive as I possibly can about it. So a lot of that, the way we dance around those kind of questions is, it depends, and I
Yeah.
and it's a very indecisive kind of
Yeah.
answer. Like, if you think about social psychology in general, we have all these kind of social phenomena and social mechanisms at work, and we see them working generally in most cases, we'll say. But the reality is it all depends on the situation. Who's there, time of day, are we tired, are we hungry, all these kind of variables at play. Now, in terms of, more directly about that question, I used to think that I had a pretty good memory, and I have a very weird sense of a weird general knowledge of years and movies and war and history and music and movie. For whatever reason, I can kind of tell you a year, and I'm typically right about it. It's a weird party trick. It's a weird flex. I don't think I'm boasting about it. It's just
Hmm.
an odd thing that I can do. But that belief has been reinforced over time by my friends, who
Hmm.
tell me that you're weird and you have a good thing, good memory for years and events, and it's almost episodic in nature, and you believe them because you're constantly told that. My world kind of turned upside down. I'm not going to say my world, but my outlook about myself in terms of my memory and how, great it
Yeah.
was, it went completely upside down when, only a couple of years ago, and I had a very, very definitive memory for 9/11. I was living in New York at the time. I was
Mm.
still in high school. And I could tell you from kind of hour by hour what was going on that day. A lot of details, very thorough. The main point is that we got to the end of the day, and everyone went off on their own way, my mother, my father, and I. And I sat down and I watched a Mets game. And they were wearing FDNY and NYPD hats. It was emotional
Hmm.
and cathartic, and as you'd expect, and probably went to bed afterwards. I don't really remember, but I remember watching the game. And then I saw a documentary a couple of years ago in which they told the story of that game. But that game wasn't played for another week and a half.
Oh, wow.
That did not happen on 9/11. And
Yeah.
then when I hear it, I go, of course it wasn't. Everything was shut down. They
Yeah.
closed everything down. And I said, then what the hell was I actually doing? And I could actually go all the way back. All those other details, 100% corroborated by other people. But because there was a gap in my knowledge, and because I knew it was such an important day, especially in the young life of someone so young, but for such a big thing to happen, there was that gap in the evening. I actually asked a couple friends very recently, and apparently we were all on AOL, we were on Instant Messenger back and forth, going, what the hell is going on? There was a lot of probably misinformation, back and forth too, which is interesting in its own right. But what was happening was my brain was telling me, in light of all this emotion, that you need to finish the story. Why is there a massive gap in your story?
Right.
And so it takes something that's meaningful, and I remember from around that time, and plops it right in there.
Well, it's a good example of how it obviously was a very, very emotional experience for you, as it was for many people. But I didn't realize you were in New York City at that time. And as
Long
we
Island.
know, what's that?
Long Island. It
Well,
was
not
Long
Long Island.
Island.
Close
But
enough. Yeah, that's
close
close enough.
enough. Close enough. Yeah. Yeah. We
Um, but,
knew
it-
we knew people.
but
But
anyway, the point I'm trying to make though is that and we know this in psychology, and as a therapist, I know this, that when strong emotions are involved in situations, then memories can get bounced around in all sorts of different directions, and your experience of things can be quite affected by that. So that's a good example. And then I think you're right. Like the mind maybe just sort of fills in the blanks to make the story make sense. And when you were looking back on it afterwards, it didn't quite make sense because you were putting the pieces together and they didn't quite add up. So I think
yeah.
that's a really good example of that.
Yeah. And I think it's just one of those things as well, is that if we're very realistic with ourselves, and I mean, it doesn't have to be something so drastic of an example, but like, I think if we're honest with ourselves about how we remember things, what we remember, and how accurate that information is, that leads to, I don't want to say developing that intellectual integrity, but I think it's a good indicator for we're not always right. And we've
Yeah.
got to be careful about that, because when it comes down to making really important decisions in our own lives, in our personal lives, that matters. That matters big time. We often think about thinking and decision making in the real world these days in a very kind of social way. I often hear people ask me about critical thinking in terms of, socializing, social media, conversation, argumentation. And yeah, they're right. There's a lot of that in a debate kind of format. The person we're constantly talking to, the person we're, talking with most of the time is ourselves.
Yeah.
We're having that inner dialogue and saying, well, what do I really think about that? And it's about being honest with ourselves and saying, could I be wrong? And how do I really know that that's how it played out? And like I said, like I've gone to friends to corroborate. I was like, what? Were we talking that day? And what happened? And do you remember? And it's going to a source, and it's going to a credible source, and it's not trusting our gut necessarily when we know that there's probably a more credible reference to
Yeah.
engage.
So, Chris, talking about credible versus not credible sources, I have to ask you about the internet in this interview. So, yeah, I know.
Where do we
Well,
begin?
well, look, these days everybody is an accidental epistemologist sleuthing around on the internet, trying to find the information they need to prove whatever, or to get information to make decisions or to make arguments. And we all know that. And I think at the time that I interviewed you last time, we talked a bit about conspiracy theories, and a lot of them were flying all over the place because of the pandemic. So things were ripe for that at that time. But obviously, the internet has become the major source of information for many, if not most people, to try to get information to understand the world around them and make their judgments and decisions about things. Okay, we know that there are problems there, but let's see, can you summarize for us what you think are the most common mistakes people make when it comes to gathering information from the internet to gain their knowledge and understanding about things and make decisions? What do we need to look out for there?
Well, I'll tell you. Just looking at my own students, a first year freshman coming in, they use the internet in a way where they go to what they believe is the source. And what I say is believing the source is It's another example of that. I don't know what I don't know. So if they don't even know that there's something like a research article, if they didn't know that this is freely available online, that you could read the study, if they don't know it, how are they going to find it? So, I get a lot of those simplepsychology.com answers. I get a lot of wiki answers, and students are referencing them. They think they've done a great job, and I go, they even have references on Wikipedia. Even if you went to those and read those sources, I give you a bit of credit for that. But I'm like, just referencing wiki. Now, I'm not saying wiki's wrong all of the time. I've no problem with it. And as a matter of fact, I think Wikipedia is a great kind of source as a starting off point to kind of give you a taste of what a field is kind of like. But would I trust it wholeheartedly? Absolutely not. The internet gets a bad rap. There's a lot of misinformation out there, but if I'm honest about, my PhD and looking back at it, I'd say less than 5% of the sources that, I actually used were tangible hard copy books and journals. I went online and I went to the appropriate, academic sources, and I found all of these papers. It was amazing. Couldn't believe, wow. And even if I didn't have access, I could request access. And oh my goodness, someone has sent me a paper from around the world. Isn't this amazing? And I just say to myself, if this was the 1960s, my PhD would have taken forever, because it would have taken me forever to
Yeah.
accumulate all this information where it's at my fingertips, and that's an amazing thing. And I think you've got sources like Google Scholar, where they give you pretty much everything you can. Obviously you might be behind paywalls and the like, but at least you're aware these things exist, and you know the titles and the authors. And I think that's a great, great, great starting point. I just wish more people knew about that. I
So
wish that
being a little bit more critical about the sources on the internet that you're looking at, paying a little more attention to that, that's one thing that's important.
That's one thing that's important. The other thing that's important is, now, say for instance, like, I'm on Instagram, as in that I just go on and I don't use it for work. This is something I don't know. Maybe there is a great application for my work on Instagram, but I'm not really seeing it yet. I'm more of a Twitter, LinkedIn guy, and Twitter's not even Twitter anymore. Maybe TikTok one day, but that's another one I haven't even signed up for. But I'm on Instagram because I have friends in America who send me funny memes and reels, and it's purely leisure and entertainment for me. But what I have noticed about that, and this is really, really a tough thing, is that I've signed up for no political influencers or users, nothing like that. But it's gravitating towards me as a 40-year-old man, I guess, is that, I'm going to be some way politically inclined. And truth be
Mhm.
told, I despise politics. I'm probably the most centrist political person there is, and I take pride in that. I take pride in that because I just find it so easy that I either believe in that or I don't believe that, and I say to myself, politics, it's a social construct, it's a belief system. Don't talk about politics. Try not to avoid it.
And talk about belief systems where people become so emotionally attached to the belief, regardless of the actual facts or information, right? I mean, politics is a
Exactly.
perfect example of polarization for the purpose of being aligned with a particular side of things.
Absolutely, and that's the thing. And I'm getting bombarded, and it's hilarious because I'll get very, very far left kind of propaganda in some videos, and I go, oh, and that's rage bait to me because I don't agree with any of that. But then the next video will be extremely far right stuff as well, and I go, oh, I hate that too. So like I'm constantly enraged by I don't have an echo chamber on Instagram where there's anything I actually do like, unless it's absolutely hilarious. And again, it's all down to my friends sending me comedy stuff.
Yeah,
But
Chris,
yeah,
maybe the true barometer of a critical thinker is one which all sides of the political spectrum have just given up on you.
yeah, maybe so, maybe so. But I do find it annoying, and I asked my wife, I was like, what is it? She's like, are you sure you don't follow? I was like, I definitely don't follow anything. We're trying to figure out the echo chamber, and I'm pretty sure it's just down to the fact that I'm a 40-year-old man, and
Yeah.
they're making certain guesses about my background, where I live, and what I'm likely to believe in. Not saying that that's not the case, but I guess my point is that watching these videos, I can see how they can reel you in. I can see how if you're, doom scrolling and you're going through and you're spending your 20, 30 seconds on a video and you're just constantly barraged with this information, it's very difficult to start teasing out real life and what's propaganda.
Right. Well, sure, because then you're getting fed the algorithms of the things that the
Mhm.
social media thinks you want to see, and then that then reinforces your reality. I think that was confirmation bias, I think, was the one we were
Yeah.
talking about, something like that in our last interview, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it is. It's kind of exploiting that.
Hmm.
It's trying to find what kind of grinds your gears or what turns you on or whatever it is. And it exploits that. You go further down the rabbit hole, and whether or not that's real life, is that how most people feel? Or is it just some kind of algorithm, like you said? And I think that's one of those kind of misinformation bits now. It's not so much this is fake news. It's actually you're being groomed in a way.
Yeah.
It's completely different than engaging information. It is essentially, priming it, so I think that's problematic. It becomes, the kind of what next kind of thing. In terms of AI, I don't think we really learned enough about it. I know ChatGPT can give you misinformation.
Let me give you a great example of misinformation. So you and I were supposed to meet last week, remember? And we missed because of time zone stuff. And I
Yeah.
apologize because I'm the host. It's my responsibility to make sure it all happens okay. But to my defense, I did ask ChatGPT what time is it in Ireland currently, so I made sure it was the right time. Guess what? It gave me the wrong time. It was just flat out wrong. Now I know that, there's been a time zone change recently in the US, and I think there was one recently in Ireland, so things kind of got jumbled up with times. But ChatGPT couldn't figure it out for me, and ultimately it messed me up. I
Yeah.
looked at that as my source of information. It was wrong.
Yeah, it's a funny one because it's no big deal, and we'll meet up and we'll chat anyway, but like if someone now was if that was a job interview, that'd be disastrous for someone.
Yeah.
That'd have real repercussions for them. And I want to say that's a simple enough, question. What time is it? So you have those times where it does kind of screw up. Now, I'm not a tinfoil hat kind of guy, but I don't use ChatGPT. I think I've seen Terminator 2 way too many times as a kid. I think I'm one of those. But my best friend, he's a smart guy, and he uses it. And he asked me about 3 or 4 weeks ago. He's like, "What's your take on it? And what do you think about students using it and all that kind of stuff?" And I was like, "I think there's a time and a place. I think it can be helpful." I was skeptical of a lot of the things that it could do. And I told him that. And I said, I can't say that I can give you a definitive answer because I don't use it. But I said, I know for a fact that when a student submits to me an assignment that has AI on it, I'm pretty good at picking it out for no other reason that it's just the type of language is number one, what I think typical human beings use, but I don't like to judge, but certainly younger college students. I said, be that as it may, will it ever give you a critically thought out answer in terms of what is AI? AI is, it's a collation of the knowledge that's out there, and there's always conflicting knowledge. And of course, it's going to probably weigh up, and it's probably going to account for more popular ideas. And I said, I'd be really interested, could it give you a critically considered answer? And so he goes, all right, I'll ask it to think critically. I said, okay, fine. And he goes, do you have a specific question, a short question that you'd like it to answer? And I said, yeah. I said, tell it to think critically and ask it if smoking causes cancer.
Hmm.
And that's one of my favorite examples from class in terms of, yes, practically speaking, that comes back to this idea we were talking about earlier. It's like, practically speaking, what's the simple answer here? Yes, smoking causes cancer. We
Well, is
know
this one
this.
of these correlation versus causation things?
Technically,
Yeah.
technically. You see, the correlation is so strong in this case that it is statistically overwhelming,
Yeah.
is a good way of putting it, I guess. And all I wanted AI to give me back an answer in the answer was to say, If it said yes, that's fine, as long as it added that caveat. If it said no, it definitely needed to get into it. But I was amazed because he sent me exactly what it said, and I go, and it's giving me all kind of logical mechanics, and I was interested in seeing that. But the fact that it said probabilistically overwhelming, and what did I
Hmm.
say earlier? I said, wow, if that's what I was looking for. That's
Okay.
really what I was looking for. So I was impressed because it gave me that, but it also gave me a whole line of logic. Now, if we asked it another nine, yeah, we'll say, for making it easy, making it out of 10, if we asked another nine crummy questions where it'd be tough to work out, even as, us trying to work it out, how would it deal with, I don't know if we would deal with it as well. I don't know, but I was very impressed.
But again, how you asked the question mattered, right? And you are a professor
Absolutely.
of critical thinking. And so you could ask it the right question to get the best possible answer. But a random person who isn't a professor in critical thinking could ask a slightly off question and get a slightly different answer. And AI is just trying to answer the question as best it can based on what was asked. And that therein is part of the problem, right?
Absolutely. The prompt massively matters.
Yeah.
And it's much like a confirmation bias, and that was another thing that I asked him. I was like, can you rework a confirmation bias? And he goes, I knew you were going to ask me that. And I go, what do you mean? And he goes, I asked it to tell me that the earth is flat,
Hmm.
and look for stuff. And ChatGPT was like, actually, the earth isn't flat.
Good.
He goes, and I was thankful for that. He goes, and then ChatGPT was saying, listen, there are some people who believe it, and these are the reasons why they would believe it. However, an outrageous amount, an alarming rate of people signal that yes, the Earth is spherical, and
Yeah.
what we know according to classical Newtonian physics. So I was happy to see that, it didn't fall prey as bad as I thought it might to confirmation bias. Like, can you prompt it to give the answer you want it to? Just having the wherewithal to say, please think critically, show me your thinking
Yeah.
behind this question. Will people do that? No, they won't. They'll ask, what day did Elvis die?
It'll be very interesting to see how AI evolves in this whole conversation about knowledge and information. I mean, I'm watching it very carefully because I'm really fascinated by it. But especially for you and what you do, it'll be really interesting to see how that unfolds.
It's extremely scary. Things are changing so rapidly. Even in the past 20 years, in my PhD, I talked about the new knowledge economy. And the basis for that was at the turn of the millennium, anyways, we were kind of doubling the amount of information that we had previously had available because the internet had taken off. By that stage now, I think the internet kind of was hitting many American homes around 94, 95, I guess. I'd say by 98, 99, a majority of homes had the internet. And then it's not unreasonable to say, okay, yeah, we're doubling information that's available out there now because of how much we're using. But just in the past 25 years, the amount of data that's created each day, the metrics for that are meaningless to me. There's a lot out there. How do we parse through the nonsense and get to the good stuff? That's why I say to my students always just go to the journal articles, just go to the research. Start from there. And if you need someone to help explain that to you, there typically is. If a big study comes out of Harvard one day, there's bound to be some kind of news article discussing it in a practical way.
Even there, Chris, talking about scientific research and published articles by seemingly reputable people. Like I'm just sort of interested in this recently because I've been studying a lot about the early research that's been done on cholesterol and LDL and cardiovascular disease and that kind of stuff. And it's very interesting because once you start going down that rabbit hole, you see that there's a lot of research that has been funded by the pharmaceutical industries, right? So there's biases that are potentially built into that. Now, I'm not here trying to take a stand on any of this stuff, but it's just very interesting when you think about where research actually comes from. Then you also might start to question, well, are these results valid or not? There's, when there's biases involved with the researchers who are doing the research, then you start to wonder those kinds of things as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So I, in a way, I would almost say that that's like critical thinking Mach 2. So then, assuming Mach 1 is forget about what websites say. Unless you have some level of expertise, I don't want to hear from you. In which case, what I mean is look at the research. But when we pump that up a level, look at who's funding it. Agreed, 100%. Look at what school of thought that research is coming from.
Right.
You're going to have sociology, psychology, and philosophy quite often examining the same topic areas, completely different approaches to investigating those areas, different
Sure.
perspectives, different mindsets. We have to address those. We have to keep those in mind. Politically speaking, if we were to politicize, and I think it's a shame that we do politicize or have to politicize academia now. Jonathan Haidt, he's a social psychologist. He gave one of the best lectures I've ever seen. He gave a talk at Duke University. It's on YouTube. But he brought it to my attention. He was looking at the political affiliations of different lecturers and professors. And there was a few studies done, but I think it was as of 2016 in the social sciences, it was a 17 to 1 ratio for left wing political persuasion. 17 to
Hmm.
1. That was up from 4 to 1, I think, in 1996. So that's a massive change in only 20 years, which says to me is that we go into a psychology lecture. Even if the lecturer doesn't say anything about I'm a Democrat or I'm this, I'm that, or left leaning or whatever, and they try to keep as unbiased as possible, there's always going to be some kind of implicit influence
Sure.
in the way in which what information they choose to present to students, and they might be very cautious. And
No, I understand, Chris. I mean, it's natural that people are going to talk about the
exactly.
issues and information that is important to them from
Mhm.
the angle or perspective that they're leaning toward without any malintent or desire to
Yeah,
persuade anybody into any particular political orientation. That's just the way we're built, right?
exactly, exactly. And our biases, our experiences, our beliefs will always kind of come through. And we're so concerned with the explicit way of doing that, but we implicitly do it as well. And that's kind of what I'm saying here. But we have to be aware of this. We have to account for this when we're looking at research. And then you have other research fields that have become talking points in the news as of late, or in academic culture at the very least, that might start their research from a biased perspective. And so
Yeah.
if you have a biased perspective to begin with, well, how can we trust that research? You
Yeah, there's
can't.
an agenda.
Exactly. And so that's problematic. And I'm not saying that's all of, there's a lot of good research out there, but there's a lot of bad research. And
Yeah.
we have to be cognizant of methodologies and look for starting from a biased perspective.
Chris, let's pivot to something a little bit lighter and more fun here, okay? I know that
Okay.
you've talked about creativity, and I believe you touch on creativity in your book, correct?
Mhm. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people think of creativity and critical thinking, reason as sort of polar opposites. Like either you're sort of creative and you're all over the place and you're not really bothered by or thinking about critical thinking or being rational or whatever. And then the opposite's true. If I'm a critical thinker, like I'm no fun at all at a party because all I'm doing is just like fact checking people or
Yeah.
whatnot.
Yeah.
Tell us, are these things, I mean, how can we reconcile these things in a way that is a little kinder to both sides of this?
Yeah, so just as much as critical thinking gets misinterpreted, I think a lot in pop culture, I think creative thinking does too. If we're going to kind of go for this stereotype of creativity, free spirited, doing my art, I'm creatively minded, whether it's music or painting or drawing or fiction writing. But that's not the only type of kind of creative thinking there. If we think about like design work for the sake of argument, in terms of a marketing standpoint, there's really important decisions to be made there. There's research evidence behind design that gives it its good idea, bad idea, but it still requires quite a bit of creativity. It's not just paint by numbers. If we're kind of looking at psychological terminology and definition, we go back to the likes of Diane Halpern, who's big name in critical thinking. and Bob Sternberg, who wrote the foreword for this book, was a really, really lovely addition. So if Bob's listening, thanks
Hmm.
again. But they kind of paint creativity in terms of, much like critical thinking, a higher order metacognitive process in which we have an outcome that is of utility, but that it's also novel or unusual. When we look at that kind of typical outlook on what creativity, we hear the novel and unusual, and we kind of go ahead with that. But like, you can be creative and come up with, some wonderful whatever it is you've created, but is it really of utility? Will it stand the test of, whatever the parameters actually are? If you were to look at it in terms of a design issue, or marketing, or however you wanted to think about, you almost apply like a problem solving protocol, right? You go with what I've got my brief, I've got my parameters, I've got my restrictions. I have to do these things. So already the creativity is already kind of limited,
Hmm.
okay, to an extent. But you do what you feel is right. You do what experience tells you. You do all these things that are completely the antithesis of what we know from critical thinking. But what they're doing is they're entertaining these ideas. And I think that's kind of useful as well. Just because I love critical thinking and I value critical thinking doesn't mean that we have to turn off this other part of us, you
Yeah.
know? But the point is that you'll create and you'll do all these feelings, but at the end, you're evaluating that. You're saying, no, that's a terrible idea. Why did I choose that to do that? You trial and error it. You're putting all these kind of fail safes in so that you're making sure that your creation actually does what it's intended to do.
Right. So, in other words, a creative person could be critical about their creative process and hopefully in a positive way, not I suck at being creative and so let me not stop doing that, but more like I'm creating something and let me use all of the information I have from my experience, from my emotional part of my life, from looking at other artists and have a way of sort of fine tuning my creativity and push it forward in a way that I suppose is pleasing to people ultimately in some way.
I always see the similarities between creativity and critical thinking first before I kind of start picking out the differences. The things that they have so much in common is that it's higher order cognition, it's metacognitive. You are thinking about thinking during it. And what you're doing is you're synthesizing information in both cases. So maybe with critical thinking, what you're doing is you're taking one research study here and you're taking another research study here. And, oh, okay, well, together these infer this conclusion. This is what I should do. Creativity, you're taking a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B.
Yeah.
It's inspiration here. That traditional look on creativity, you would say, this is what I've created, warts and all. I don't care if you like it or you don't like it and whatever. That's all well and good. And if it makes you feel good, well, then it's fulfilled its purpose. But if there was a specific utility to it, you'd want to do those checks, you want to do those evaluations, you want to try it, you want to simulate it. Again, it depends. It comes down to how we conceptualize creative thinking.
So, Chris, I have another one here. How about the sister of creativity, and that may be intuition? People who intuitively come to decisions about things, and they're not necessarily thinking critically in their mind about, this is, I kind of feel like this is the right answer for me, and it's just, coming from the ether or wherever. What do you have to say about intuition?
I'm going to play good cop, bad cop on this.
Okay.
We look at the word eureka. It's come to me. I've had a great
Yeah,
epiphany.
boom, like a lightning
Boom.
bolt.
Yeah, that's where when we hear the word from cognitive psychology, heuristics, it stems from eureka. I have found it, and that's problematic because you found something, but where did you find it? And just as he said, it's kind of like, from the ether kind of thing. The likelihood is it's either an attitude, a feeling, a belief, or something you've experienced in some way in the past, and that's well and good, and it might work, and it might be right, but it might not. So why would you risk it if what you're doing matters? Intuition, good cop perspective, is evolutionarily advantageous. It is an amazing artifact of what it is to be human, that we are able to make split second decisions like that. It's incredible. It's evolutionary advantageous because, we'd have to be aware of predators around us, and your body goes into flight mode or fight mode or freeze and appease and, what have you. It's for our benefit. It is a good thing. But it's also a good thing in terms of making bad decisions or good decisions. And it doesn't matter in situations that don't matter. I often talk about, every time you order a cup of coffee, one coffee place, famous, used to boast 19,000 possible permutations of beverages.
Hmm.
We don't go in and eliminate 18,999 before we order our coffee. We go for our regular, and that's what we want.
Yep.
Because you know what? You can't really screw that one up, or it'll be fine. It'll be good enough. It doesn't matter. That's what intuition is. It gives us answers to questions that don't really matter or shouldn't really matter. Like, I mean, which route should I take to work today to avoid traffic? I'm going to get that wrong half the time, but so what? I lose 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. What's the big deal? So, intuition is not a bad thing per se. It gets a bad rap a lot of the time. I painted a very bad picture of it because in the book, because we don't want that when we're thinking critically. That is the last thing we want to do. But for topics that don't matter, for things that don't really matter to us, intuition is fine. Like I said, going back to the idea of creative thinking, if we were involved heavily in creative thinking, we'd want a lot of our intuition. And if it turns out that our intuition was wrong, we can eliminate that later on in the process. But intuition is so powerfully important for those things. But, when the stakes are high, when things matter, I'm not going to necessarily go with my gut. I'm going to look at what the research says. I'm going to look at what the experts say. And when I'm evaluating all that material and when I'm collating it together to infer that solution, that's where my gut might come in terms of good decision making. Because assuming I'm used to playing the part of the critical thinker, that I've gone through this process enough time, I know what to look for in terms of credibility. I know when something looks a little sketchy. That intuition is fine. There's nothing wrong with that intuition. It's that intuition that, automatically jumps at you and says, you need to pick this one. You need to pick that one. And it
Hmm.
might be right. And that's fine. It might be right. But let me evaluate all the other perspectives first.
Right. I'm going to go on this very important medication or choose not to go on this very important medication because of an intuition. Maybe not the best situation in that specific time to make a decision based on intuition, right?
Exactly. I mean, and that's not to say if your intuition says I shouldn't go on it, your intuition may be right. But why are you taking that risk? What a critically considered perspective would be to see what your doctor says,
Yeah.
seek a second opinion, hell, even seek a third opinion, even go online and check out the reputable sources on that drug. Now, the reputable sources are not those people who have an axe to grind against that drug.
Right.
And
Which
they're
you see a
also,
lot. You see a lot of that
which you
on the
see a
internet.
lot, yeah. So you don't want that, but you also don't want from the makers of,
Yeah.
you don't want the source of the drug either. You want to read a clinical trial on it, and you need to see are there actually any adverse effects? And there's always going to be adverse effects or side effects or what have you, but they're statistically unlikely. And why I say unlikely is because in a majority of the time you don't see those, but they can happen. That's why they have to put those risks down. Doesn't mean it's always going to happen. You're doing a pros and cons list, essentially a simplified version, or I'm simplifying it quite a bit, but that's what you're doing, and you're trying to decipher that way. But just going off your gut is probably not the best idea. You'd want to look into it as much as you could.
Okay, Chris, I've got one more curveball type of question for you today, and you're probably not prepared for this one, which is why it's going to be fun. But
Uh-oh.
I got the idea of this question from your most recent Psychology Today blog post, and this is about the perception of time.
Oh, okay.
I think that's your most recent blog post. You might have written one since then, but I saw that one and it was quite interesting. And I'm just sort of curious about this idea about time from a critical thinker, intellectual's perspective. Chris, does time actually exist? And is our perception of time somehow affected by our cognitive awareness? I'm just curious about your thoughts about time. It's such a fascinating topic for people.
I'm going to say first and foremost, I love sci-fi. I love time travel movies, and it's a big interest of mine. Obviously, in terms of physics, space-time continuums and all that, from a Einsteinian perspective, what is time? Time is relative. So does that make it not exist? Yes, I guess it doesn't exist, but it also, we have a notion of what is time. So from an epistemological standpoint, yes, time is very real. Time is what permitted us to meet up together to have this conversation. But it's a human construct because we have put parameters on time. We've decided that we're going to have 12 hours in the morning and 12 hours in the so yeah, we have time, but from a perspective it changes. So we say time flies when you're having fun. Time flies when you get older. I think I remember everything from the year 1995. I think I probably remember every day of the summer of 1995. I could tell you the top 40 list from 1995. I was only 10 years old in 1995. I was at that age where I was aware of things in the outside world. Everything was so exciting to me. You have people out there who their earliest memories are from the age two. My earliest memories from around age two. My earliest memory I remember was WrestleMania 3 had just come on,
Uh-huh.
and my mom and dad were getting my little blue onesies on me, and I remember wanting to see this match because it was Andre the Giant and Hulk Hogan. It's a silly thing, but it was kind of one of those things that I guess I always liked wrestling. I watched wrestling kind of on a weekly basis with my dad. A meaningful kind of situation because it was such a big match. The point is that when you're younger, once you've developed to age two, your brain is working in a way where it wasn't really tracking memories before. It's tracking things now. You remember things. Your language development is becoming in ways in reference to things that have happened before. So, like when you think of object permanence, babies don't have it, until a certain age.
Right. If something's gone, it no longer exists.
Exactly. They are aware once they get object permanence. Oh, it was in front of me, and now you've just put it behind your back because I remember you having it in front of me and you've put it behind your back. And then they walk around you and they go, there it is. And so memory starts kind of developing there, but it's very interesting because everything starts happening so fast for kids. And they're sponges. They have no reference point. Their whole life is only a few months, a handful of months when you really think about it.
Yeah.
So every piece of information coming in takes forever for them. So, like, my daughter is 6 now, and she remembers a reasonable amount of information, but it's amazing the detail, the obscure things that she would remember. I say, why would you remember that? I just do. Because she doesn't have much reference at all, really. It's her whole world there, where I'm a little different. I have 40 years. I do very well to remember things that mattered to me in my childhood because I had very little reference there. But you hear people talk about, I don't even know what I had for breakfast. That's not a stretch of the imagination for anyone, I think, of a certain age, because the fact is that these things aren't important to us.
Are you sort of saying that you would expect time to be slower for children than for adults because
Absolutely. Yeah.
children are absorbing so much novel information
Yeah.
that everything seems relevant, and so there's just more stuff, whereas when you're an adult and you're going through your mundane day to day, it just sort of passes by and you're not paying much attention to it, so it goes by quicker. Is that sort of your thesis around this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, there's a philosophical slant on it in terms of, you know, existentially speaking. If a 4-year-old is only around for 4 years, like I said, they don't have much reference. Everything
Right.
is important.
Well, okay, Chris. So we agree that perhaps in general, children feel like time is slower than adults, where time seems to pass quicker for the reasons we just talked about. So why is it then that adults sometimes have differing perceptions on the passage of time? Because adults will say sometimes time seems like it's passing quickly, and sometimes it seems like it's passing more slowly. And I guess the related question to that is, how can we have it pass more slowly more of the time? Because adults usually complain that time seems like it's passing too quickly.
I think you kind of alluded to it earlier. Being an adult obviously involves a lot of adulting, and a lot of that is quite mundane, right? Looking at it from a cognitive schema perspective, is that we know we expect all these things we kind of deal with on a day-to-day basis. You have a schedule, you know what's coming up, you know that you need to do this. You might not be happy that you need to do this, but you kind of get through it, and you don't have to work terribly hard sometimes on these kind of admins, or I have to go here, I have to do this, where everything is so exciting for
Hmm.
a kid. This is my first trip to this kind of shop, this is my first trip to this kind of shop. I can imagine now, like, going into the supermarket, and you walk past the fish section. You don't think about that anymore. It's just like, oh, fish, yeah, as you would. Or I
Yeah.
remember walking past a fishmonger's or something when I was little and go, oh my God, what is this? And then I'd say to my mom, what is that? She goes, it's fish. You've smelled fish before. And it's like, no, this is weird.
Yeah.
So like everything is so new, and they're just taking in everything. Like I said, little sponges, where we're just kind of flying by the seat of our pants, relying on our schemas, relying on our heuristics, and just kind of following an experience-based protocol as we go through life. And some people say, like, oh, that week flew, and it's probably because nothing monumentally important happened. You just
Hmm.
went through the motions. And so I guess then, to address that's the second part of your question, it's like, what can we do to kind of slow things down? It's a cliche, but it is: wake up and smell the coffee. Evaluate, what's going on in your life, and what's important to you, and what do you wish you could do more of. And it can be like pursuing a new hobby. If you have a family and you want to spend more time with your family, make time for that, make room for that. I think it's important that we kind of, every now and then do that inventory of our lives, I guess. And some people, have that horrible habit of, that's what they think about before they go to sleep. They can't sleep, and then they're thinking about all those things that they should be doing, and then by the time they wake up in the morning, they go, up off to work, I got to get going, and then it becomes this kind of vicious cycle. But I think it's important to kind of evaluate goals and think about what you want to achieve, and take time out for yourself to explore something new, something different. Create that novelty in your own life so that it will be memorable. I took my kids to a pumpkin patch for Halloween a couple weeks ago, and I haven't been to a pumpkin patch since I was about 7 years old. It was incredible, and it's a day I'll never forget. Largely because it was so new for me as well. I knew what to expect. I knew what was going to be there, but living it is so much different than,
Oh,
you
it's
know,
so true. And so many people who, when they have children, say that it's sort of like reliving childhood again, just maybe from a different lens. But I think that's very true. Like there's a lot of opportunity to shake things up and do things differently than how you have done them as an adult when once again, you have children. That's a great point.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, to be honest with you, I've got a lot of things on in my life, and if you were to tell me we're going to now, this pumpkin patch, as it turns out, was about an hour and a half away from our house, so it was a 3 hour spin, doing the whole thing. And if you were to tell me we're going to go for a pumpkin patch, and we're going to go and we're going to walk around for a couple hours, and it's going to be cold and wet, and this is one of your days off, it's like, no. If someone approached me with that, I would say no. But it was just that I saw a picture of it being advertised. I said, that looks really cool. So because it was my idea, and something kind of hit me and said, I would like to do that. But the fact is, we went, and I wasn't even sure it was a good idea. But when we got there and we went through the day, and we were there about an hour or so, and I remember kind of looking at the kids kind of running around, and even the silly stuff that we were doing. We got a bite to eat there. They had mini golf there. It was fun. There was stuff to do. And I said, remember, kind of looking at the kids. I'm like, glad I came. Glad we did this.
Hmm.
I didn't think I was going to enjoy it as much as I did, but I'm glad I kind of picked it out and said, let's do this, because if, like I said, if someone had said it to me, I'd be like, you're crazy. No way. Don't want to do
Yeah.
that.
Do you celebrate Halloween in Ireland the same way that we do in the US?
We do now. That's only kind of changed maybe in the last 15 to 20 years. Trick or treating wasn't really a big thing before that, and we used to have bonfire night. So that was the big thing, that there'd just be bonfires and that sort of thing, and maybe watching old horror movies.
Oh, fun. Yeah. Well, Chris, let's start winding down here with this interview, which has been super
Okay,
fun and lively. I've enjoyed it.
good.
And maybe you could leave us with a couple of thoughts here briefly. So, again, back to your book about knowledge, and tell us maybe one thing in your book that you think readers will find the most uncomfortable, and what you think about the book that you hope that readers take away from it that's most important.
Most uncomfortable. I hope most of it is uncomfortable because I think sometimes you kind of need to put caution into people. I guess one of the main messages is that caution, is that life is uncertainty. We don't need to be afraid of that. We need to embrace that. We need to be happy about that. I think it's a good thing because it makes us more careful in our decision making. So if big decisions scare you, good. That's a good first step. What should be concerning to people is that their gut is not always right, regardless of what they've been told. I know it's very popular in pop culture, that kind of belief. What might be kind of disarming to people is that their feelings don't matter, their beliefs don't matter. I had a student last week who asked me when she was writing an assignment, she goes, "So are we just supposed to write down our feelings about this?" And I told her, "I don't care about your feelings." And I'm perfectly honest and pure deadpan too. There was no comedy about it, even though the rest of the class started laughing hysterically. I said, "I don't
Right.
care how you feel. I care what you can evidence. That's what I care, how you can use that evidence information and apply that in a meaningful way. That's what I care about." Because as you said earlier, Aaron, is like our feelings and our attitudes and all of that, that's always going to come through in some way, implicitly, explicitly, however. But let us do that in a way where it's as objective as it possibly can be. I remember I wrote a piece years ago, one of the first times I wrote about emotion being a significant barrier to critical thinking. And I said, you need to leave emotion at the door. And of course, there's always comments, and one comment was, "This is a stupid statement because you can never eliminate emotion. Emotion's always there." And I said, "You're absolutely 100% right." I was like, "But obviously you didn't read, you didn't read the whole part because we have to do this as best we can because emotion is always going to creep in. It's always going to tell us what you think, what you feel, like intuitive judgment. It's that system one getting in the way of that system two thinking. You need to acknowledge it and just put it to the side. And people don't like that. That's one kind of thing I'm noticing now, and I'm surprised that there is as much resistance to this idea that their feelings don't matter.
That's the thing is people, feel like they're, I'm using the word feel, like they feel that feelings are uniquely something that they own, and if they're being denied the right to have their feelings, somehow they're being denied the right to exist or something. Like it's very people have very strong thoughts and feelings about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I mean, and people are entitled to that. I have zero problem with people having feelings. Like, I mean, I think it's a very strange thing for a psychologist to say, feelings are useless, or let's ignore them. That's counterintuitive to good mental health, obviously, but strictly in terms of critical thinking, we have to put that to the side and we have to say, what can I evidence? I think that's sometimes, a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people.
Yeah. And then how about what you hope that people take most from the book?
That we're not as smart as we think we are, even though we are incredible. The human mind is an amazing thing, what it can accomplish, but we are not as right as we often think. Daniel Kahneman made an allusion to in his book Thinking Fast and Slow. He said people, they value their experience, particularly when they have a lot of experience. The problem is that people might just have a lot of experience doing the wrong thing. I love the way he puts that. But I think we can also kind of say as well that people might have a lot of experience doing something suboptimally. And what I mean by that is that it's not that you're doing it wrong, because I think if you're doing something wrong, you'd eventually cop onto it. You'd eventually, oh, maybe I should, do it this way. But I think it's a lot more insidious when you're doing something that it's kind of working or it works well enough. And it's an unfortunate thing we don't see that there is a better way that we could be doing it. And so it's not that we're going through life making mistakes all of the time. It's that we're going through life not realizing that if we just tweaked one or two things through better thinking, we could be doing it better. And I suppose, that people are open to being wrong. People are more open to saying, I don't know. People are more open to asking for help, asking questions, and engaging, credible sources, and instead of disagreeing because it doesn't feel right and then making 20 YouTube videos about it, and
Yeah.
trying to start a cult essentially around some asinine kind of concept.
Yeah.
But I think if people just own up to the potential of being wrong, I think we'd be, in a lot more of in a better working world, I guess is a way of saying, a more efficient world, shall we
Yeah.
say.
Yeah. Very wise words, Chris, and thank you for that. And your book is super interesting. And by the way, I wish I was a student in one of your classes. It sounds like you're a really fun and interesting professor. So your students are lucky to have you at the
Oh, I
university there.
appreciate that. I try that. I try.
Yeah, sure. Hey, this has been a great conversation. I know I threw a lot at you, and it's late at night for you in Ireland, so I appreciate your perseverance here and willingness
No problem.
to talk with me. Thanks so much for coming in and or meeting me online.
No problem, Aaron. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to MindTricks Radio. I hope you have enjoyed the program. For more information about MindTricks, you can go to my website, www.waikikihealth.com. Be sure to subscribe to MindTricks on your preferred podcasting host to be notified of new episodes of MindTricks. Please take some time to give MindTricks a good rating and review wherever you are listening. It really helps get the word out to new listeners. And please like and share MindTricks posts on Twitter and Facebook by following your host, Dr. Aaron Kaplan.